92, and we'll begin reading from the 12th verse through the 15th verse as we hear these words from truly a song, and a song intended for the Sabbath day. The righteous will flourish like a palm tree. They will grow like a cedar of Lebanon, planted in the house of the Lord. They will flourish in the courts of our God. They will still bear fruit in old age, and they will stay fresh and green, proclaiming, "The Lord is upright. He is my rock, and there is no wickedness in him." And then our reading from the New Testament as we continue to journey with the Gospel writer Matthew. We read this morning from chapter 7, the verses 1 through 14, and then we will skip down to verse 24 through 29. And it might help to keep in mind that these are the last pieces of the Sermon on the Mount as we look at chapter 7. Do not judge, or you too will be judged. For in the same way you judge others, you will be judged. And with the measure you use, it will be measured to you. Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? How can you say to your brother, "Let me take the speck out of your eye," when all the time there is a plank in your own eye? You hypocrite, first take the plank out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye. Do not give dogs what is sacred. Do not throw pearls to pigs. And if you do, they may trample them under their feet and turn and tear you to pieces. Ask, and it will be given to you. Seek, and you will find. Knock, and the door will be opened to you. For everyone who asks receives, the one who seeks finds, and to the one who knocks, the door will be opened. Which of you, if your son asks for bread, will give him a stone? Or if he asks for a fish, will give him a snake? If you then, though you are evil, know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will your Father in heaven give good gifts to those who ask him? So in everything, do to others what you would have them do to you. For this sums up the law and the prophets. Enter through the narrow gate, for wide is the gate, and broad is the road that leads to destruction, and many enter through it. But small is the gate, and narrow the road that leads to life, and only a few find it. And then skipping down to verse 24. Therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine, Jesus says, and puts them into practice, is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house. Yet it did not fall, because it had its foundation on the rock. But everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice is like a foolish man who built his house on sand. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell with a great crash. When Jesus had finished saying these things, the crowds were amazed at his teaching, because he taught as one who had authority, and not as their teachers of the law. This is God's holy word for us this day. Lily, I'm going to invite you to join me up here as we look at a couple of these stories. Have a seat. So our scripture today has a couple parables, a lot of stories of comparison, and we're going to look at those in a minute. And at first glance, most of them don't make sense, or we're just questioning, I wonder what that means. So one of those stories, which finishes up the Sermon on the Mount, is about building houses. All of these stories, and Lily's going to help me here to demonstrate this one, but these stories, as you might have already noticed, are about things that people would relate to. They're about the crop coming in. They're about making bread. They are stories about walking on the path, walking through gates. You'll remember that the city of Jerusalem had many gates. And so they're all stories that might be confusing to us, but were relatable. And that final story about building houses was certainly something that Jesus understood. So these are going to be our houses, Lindley. And if you will put one in the sand and build one on the rock. Oh, she's helping the sand one out here by filling it in. So Jesus tells us a story of a wise man and a foolish man. So, but they both built houses. And so one built their house in the sand and one built their house on the rock. Which do you think was the foolish man and which one was the wise one?
Probably the sand.
The sand? Why do you think?
Because if it was a storm, it would probably knock over because the sand's not that strong.
Okay, so the wise man would have put his house then on the rock. So shall we see if you're right? So even in, okay, sure, she's all for this. Okay, so which one do you want to do first?
This
Okay. So we know that even in the desert, so what happened to the foundation? What happened to all that nice sand that you helped put up underneath that?
It flooded because the water went over it.
Yeah, so it hasn't knocked over yet, but this one moved a little bit, didn't it? But you were right, aren't you? Because eventually we're going to wash away all the sand. Oh, yeah, it wiggled some. Yeah, if I had more water, we could take care of it. But you're right. So we tested that. But absolutely, it would be the one in the sand. Because it didn't have a good foundation, even though you tried to help it. So we're going to look at these stories. And so what is this silly story about two houses? There you go. You can leave it down. It knocked over. You're right. It's not stable, is it? You can leave it over. So what do silly stories like this tell us about life? So that's going to be our question today. Okay.
Don't build a house on the sand.
Well, that's one answer, and there's some others too. So we're going to listen for those, okay? Thanks for helping me. I'll let you go back to. Because these are more than stories. These are more than thoughts to ponder. These are Jesus' teachings. And for a moment this morning, I invite you to think about sitting out on the hillside. Maybe you've been there a while. Although scholars believe that all these pieces of the Sermon on the Mount actually were probably stories that happened in different encounters, and that the gospel writer Matthew just put them all together in a clump so that we would pay more attention to them. But the actual Sermon on the Mount that begins with the Beatitudes, which we looked at last Sunday, probably happened in one setting. So let's say you've already experienced the blessings of God in those Beatitudes, and then you start to hear these words that are part of the final part of the Sermon on the Mount. Maybe it's a whole different setting, but this section, this tail end of the sermon, is where we find several teachings of Jesus known as hyperbole. They're exaggerations to to make a point. And Lindley helped us see one with our houses. This portion of Jesus' inaugural address or sermon early in his ministry addresses the potential threats to the life of the community. So while you're gathered to hear these words of Jesus, put yourselves in the footsteps of the disciples, the 12 that have just been called to be part of Jesus' ministry. And then all those other disciples gathered that are beginning to be the followers of Jesus. Think of these stories from that perspective. These stories, or these hyperbole, also affirm God's accountability to God's children and call all of these disciples toward mutual accountability to one another. The final saying in verse 12, the golden rule, is the capstone for this passage, and actually for the sermon itself. The chapter also ends with the crowds being amazed at Jesus' teaching. The people are aware of his authority. The teachers of the law quoted other rabbis to support their teachings. But Jesus spoke with a divine authority. So we begin with judgment, one of the trickiest parts of community life. When people stand in judgment of one another, they take over God's authority and rupture the fabric of the community. There are numerous reasons why we should not judge others. We know them. In the first place, we don't know their full story, nor fully understand all of the issues involved. And second, we are judged based on emotions and not facts in most cases. Third, this is the big one, only God is competent to judge another. Who are we to judge another? Jesus reminds us that those who judge, because we all do, but we're going to be held accountable, and held accountable to the same standards by which we condemn others. Another way of saying, do not judge your neighbor until you have walked in their shoes. This is a valid statement, but Jesus takes it another step and simply says, don't judge. Don't do it. We usually judge others to make ourselves feel better. One who develops a judgmental attitude tends to separate themselves from others in the community. Another lesson here, if you harshly judge others, you must expect to be judged harshly by the judge of all. All of this is to remind us of that destructive criticism is counterproductive. It's not helpful to the community. Harsh and petty fault-finding becomes a corrosive chemical that erodes relationships wherever people have to work together to achieve common goals. However, one must exercise appropriate discernment at the same time by holding one another accountable. The opening prohibition against judging is not meant to cut short either the disciples' exercise of discernment or their care for and accountability to one another. We are first to judge our own actions and find the correction which God's grace can achieve. And then we will be able to take the speck or the sawdust out of the brother's eye. The refusal to be judgmental does not mean we can't be helpful, But helping another at their point of need must be done with a spirit of grace and understanding. Which leads us to the next illustration, the image of the log and the speck. Remind us of Jesus' story about the servant who is forgiven a huge debt, then in turn goes around and condemns another servant for a tiny obligation, says pay up and do it now. Both stories are about a failure to understand and see clearly the meaning of mercy. Those who notice their neighbor's specks often do overlook their own logs. Jesus is not telling the disciples to ignore the specks in their neighbor's eyes, but first to remove their own logs or planks which distort the view. Jesus is thinking more about those who stand in self-righteous condemnation of others, especially while failing to recognize their own offense. This is a call to self-awareness and compassion. The community of disciples is built upon relationships made right and preserved in sharing, mutual care, compassion, and always aware of God's mercy towards all. And then we start hearing stories about pearls, and pearls being thrown in with the pigs. The line about casting pearls before the swine appears to warn against the dangers of trampling or mauling when sharing with others what they cannot appreciate or understand. Both swine, pigs, and dogs were considered unclean in Jesus' time and might have been images of misunderstanding, risk, and frustrated hope. They make us much more aware of the fragile community and may steer us toward better attention to compassion and that mutual accountability. Stories that help us think about our own actions towards the actions of others. Ask, seek, and knock. These three words are both command and invitation. In the Greek, all three of these words mean continuous action. Ask and keep asking in prayer. Seek and keep seeking knowledge of God. Knock and keep knocking until the door to the kingdom is open. The progression of the words suggests a growing awareness of our own dependence upon God. Ask, then seek, and then knock. It's all about the Father's compassion and care for the children of God. Jesus encourages the disciples, together and as individuals, to be always asking, seeking, searching, and knocking. Our first impression, however, of these verses appear to promise that we can get anything we pray for as long as we pray with sufficient and intense asking, seeking, and continued knocking. But we know that's not true. Like a TV evangelist assuring us that we can pray successfully for $1 million if only we follow their plan, their recipe for prayer, and cooperate with the Lord. The New Testament makes it clear that prayer is not intended as a means of manipulating God into satisfying our own desires. Actually, as most of or all of us have experienced, our own unselfish prayers may go unanswered. Even Jesus prayed earnestly in the garden, My Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but yours. We must be reminded that earlier in this Sermon on the Mount, we have been asked to forego anger and retaliation, to love our enemies, to forgive those who have injured us, and to control our criticism of others. And now these words of judgment. How can we fulfill all these demands and then ask and seek and knock? They are all reminders that for all of us, this is impossible. But with God, all things are possible. Only by persistently asking, seeking, and knocking at heaven's door through prayer will we find grace to obey what seem like impossible commands. We must depend upon God's grace always. Jesus promises results, for God is more trustworthy than humans. So, following ask, seek, and knock, follow the comparisons. Give good gifts. Bread and fish, rather than stones and snakes to children who ask. Again, at the heart of the community of disciples is the promise of God's faithful attentiveness, compassion, and provision, which is exactly what the disciples are to seek in their relationships of justice and solidarity with one another. In verse 12, the end of our first section of Matthew's reading today, Jesus sums up that part of the sermon with the golden rule. The golden rule here serves as a summary, not only of saying about love our enemies and not retaliating, but of all the other ethical teaching as well. It becomes Matthew's condensed version of all the teachings concerning the righteousness that anticipates the kingdom of heaven. The golden rule is to be understood and applied as a Christian principle. It is a summary of Jesus' interpretation of the law and of the prophets. Since God is loving and full of mercy, humans do not need to attend first of all to their own interests, but are free to do to others as you would have them do to you. Doing to others as you would have them do to you generates a community of care and compassion and mutual accountability. In other words, removing both one's own laws and then the specks in the eyes of others. A community that embodies God's justice and mercy. Then Jesus' sermon closes with the two ways, two gates, two roads, and two builders. Both comparing the way of the world and the way of God's reign. These both provide warnings and encouragement. Jesus eliminates the middle ground and encourages the choice for God's rule and righteousness. Gates and roads emphasize the difficulty of the path that lies before those who choose discipleship, using the contrast of wide and narrow, easy and hard, many and few. The disciples are among the few who may find the narrow and hard road. Their way is not the favored choice. It is the path of greater resistance, the more treacherous route across the boulder field. And then we have the contrast of the house that withstands the storms, the floods, and the winds with the other house that does not. Don't forget that Jesus knew about building. His knowledge came from his work as carpenter. The story is also relevant in the land around Galilee. There were many valleys, which were dry gullies in the summer, but when it rained, became filled with rushing water. The two houses represent not good and bad construction practices, but here, wise and foolish choices of building sites. The foolish person builds just as sturdy of a building. Lindley helped with two houses that were identical. That foolish person, sturdy building, was just like the sturdy building of the wise person, but makes the incredible mistake of building a house on the sands of a wadi, the dry bed of a seasoned river. When the rainy season arrives with its violent storms, a wild torrent rushes down the wadi from the hills. We might say a flash flood, and it engulfs the house, its foundation. The foolish builder had chosen an easy building site without considering the consequences of his choice. The parable sharply contrasts two ways of responding to Jesus' teaching. The outstanding church leaders mentioned in earlier verses have indeed heard Jesus' words over and over again, but they have refused to make those the words, the rules of life. As a result, their reputation as leaders in the law is built on nothing more than shifting sand. On the other hand, there are humble believers who can claim no special gifts, but to listen well to Jesus' words and strive to live by them. The lives they build upon the rock will be able to withstand the storms of this life. This is also a lesson on discipleship, for we are building our faith as we walk with Christ. Such building calls for a good and sure foundation, a rock-solid base. This is exactly what Jesus was providing for all the disciples, the followers through his teachings. The rock upon which the wise one builds is the teaching of Jesus, but not his words alone. The sand contrast is not between hearing and not hearing, but between those who hear and take action, and those who hear but do not do a thing. The last words focus on the house built on sand, whose fall was great. And we are left to ponder with the disciples which road they will take, the narrow and the hard, and which house will they build. Because the Sermon of the Mount stands out as this beginning of Jesus' ministry, we spend time with it. And if we dig deeper into the sermon, we know that a good sermon moves to a goal. If I just stand here and talk at you, and we don't get anywhere, you're going to say, what was that about? A good sermon has a rock-solid finish. As we listen to a message, we are often called to act, to take action based on the message. Jesus was a good teacher and a speaker. His sermon moved to a conclusion that called for action. The choice is now, with all of those disciples gathered, the 12 and all of those others, having heard Jesus' teachings, they then have the choice. Put into action his words and teachings or not. Jesus finishes his message clearly placing the emphasis squarely on the hearing and the doing. Therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice. Matthew then reports that the crowds were astounded by the authority of Jesus. It is no wonder that the crowds were astonished, for they discerned the authority with which Jesus spoke. It was not simply the authority of the scholar, as the scribe could quote at length from the fathers, but the authority of the one who, on the behalf of God, calls persons to act, to obey. Jesus assured all of those listening on the mountainside of the long-lasting, the eternal benefits of acting and obeying. With prompts, the astonishment is not so much the content of Jesus' teaching, but the authority with which Christ declares God's purpose for their lives, for the community. The people gathered along with the chosen 12 seem to detect a different kind of power than they have heard among the rabbis interpreting the law. The crowds may not yet be able to name it, but they are beginning to see in Jesus' teachings and his actions the power of God. I think there's a reason this parable of rock and sand is at the end of the sermon. Maybe out of all of these illustrations, that one stands out the most. But perhaps it is because we tend to look at it as, what's our foundation look like? A couple years ago when I was in Greece, I had the privilege of visiting what is called the Meteora complex. It is overlooking the Thessaloniki plain in Greece near the town of Kalambaka. It is nothing, here's the quote, Meteora is nothing other than a group of lofty and precipitous rocks crowned with monasteries, retreats. Today, I'm going to show you some pictures here, and I'll have it available after too. Today, there are still 6 monasteries that continue to do their work. So to start with, you've got to think of wherever you've seen just high pillars of rock. And on these pillars of rock that really surround this entire area are built the monasteries. These complexes for the monks and the nuns now to gather. They will use lifts to get, let's see if I can find that picture for you. Oh, here's another one. So all of these pillars are just dotted with structures. And think about those foundations. To get supplies to them, some now have roads. Many, still to this day, send the provisions up by rope and pulley. Some are isolated more than others, which feeds into that concept of monasteries looking out. And while, from far away it looks like there's nothing on those rocks, all of them are dotted with different structures as these monasteries have found a place with a solid foundation. They have built upon places to gather with God, places to take time to be with God. Since the 11th century, these people of faith have, right there before our eyes, built solid foundations of faith. So even as you take a look at some of those pictures, I think this amazing feat, just to have those buildings built on top of rocky, precipitous pillars, reminds us that we too need foundations. We need to be in worship. We need to study God's word. We need to ask and seek and knock. For those are all part of God building up that rock, that solid foundation, instead of the sand that will shift and wash away. Matthew, throughout his gospel, and especially in the chapters relating to the Sermon on the Mount, makes a strong statement which weaves together the gospel's good news, but also ethics, faith, and morality. Matthew challenges those who claim that accepting Jesus as Lord and Savior is all that is required of them. The concluding warning of the Sermon on the Mount sends this message instead. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will I enter the kingdom of heaven? But only the one who does the will of my Father in heaven, Jesus says. Matthew stresses the devotion to Jesus as Lord by obeying his ethical instructions. The righteousness that surpasses that of the scribes and the Pharisees consists of not just possessing the teaching of Jesus, but in acting upon them. This is only the beginning of Jesus' authority being recognized and identified. It appears here in Matthew's gospel for the first time, but it will be repeated often until we finally reach the climatic declaration of the Great Commission. All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Matthew reminds us at the end of the Sermon on the Mount, just as he did at the very beginning of that sermon, this is all about the Son of God, Messiah, Jesus the Christ. We are meant to hear this sermon and the teachings of Jesus not merely from a wise teacher, but from one whose sermons and teachings are from the Lord and King. The good news is rock solid, and the believers are challenged to put all of Jesus' words into action. His ministry has definitely begun with a foundation of authority that is rock solid from beginning to end. May it always be so. Amen.